In this video, I go and give a detailed answer to Pop Quiz 1. The question in the Pop Quiz was, how is the indigenous flag of Britain the red dragon on white? And the hint that was given in that Pop Quiz number 1 was the red dragon was brought to Britain by Roman Sarmatian cavalry at Ribchester, but its deeper meaning came from Britons linking the constellation Draco with the birth of Ursa Minor, the little bear, a symbol of the dragon, introducing the bear. This is going to be a detailed video. If you haven't got time for it, just skip back to the previous video and just do the pop quiz. They're just 12 quick questions, each with a question and a hint. How well do you know Britain? So in this video, we're going to answer that question, which I'll read again. How is the indigenous flag of Britain the red dragon on white? Now let's have a look at the image behind me. There's a red dragon, there's a sunrise coming up in the east, there's a silhouette of King Arthur pulling the sword from the stone, there are some ravens there in the sky, there's a constellation in the now diminishing night sky because the rising sun is coming up, and of course therefore there's a relationship between a constellation in the sky called Draco and also the red dragon. But there's also a relationship between another constellation, that is being Ursa Minor the little bear, which relates to the name of Arthur, because of course Arthur comes from the Walsh, that is formerly Brythonic, spelling of A-R-T-H, which means bear. And in a sense, this relates to the third of the 4 great prophecies of Arthurian Britain: Arthur will return as a raven. So we have very many converging and conflating concepts here, and we're now going to simply answer that question. So let's go back to, say, 2 centuries prior to Christ being born, and this was about 2 centuries really before Caesar attempting his invasion of Britain. And in this context, the Romans and Greeks had introduced to the Celts the names that we know of the constellations Draco and also Ursa Minor. So although, of course, the Celts had seen these various constellations and stars for centuries beforehand, it was the Romans and Greeks who actually introduced the names that we're going to actually talk about. So Draco was the name of the constellation that for centuries preceding this, all of the way back to 2787 BC, and the significance here is that the constellation Draco commanded the North Star, Thuban, and Thuban was at the closest to the North Celestial Pole in 2787 BC. In the centuries before that, of course, it had been getting closer and closer, and after 2787 BC, it started moving away, and by the time we get to the Sarmatians arriving, of course, the Draco had simply moved so far away, with the constellation Ursa Minor moving into significance. Ursa Minor commands the pole star Polaris, and Polaris has since been getting closer and closer. Polaris isn't at its closest until 2100 AD. So we've got 75 years until the whole Polaris gets its closest and then starts moving away. And you might think in the back of your mind, if there was some sort of celestial effect on the stories from the Sarmatians up until the time of Arthur, which we now know is part of Arthurian canon, we can also expect that between now and 75 years hence, when Polaris actually becomes the closest to the North Celestial Pole, that there's going to be an evolution and impending sense of hope, as simply as we on Earth, in the psychology of our mind, just start simply dwelling on these stories, and as it gets closer and closer, we're going to simply start manifesting a likeness to the story, or at least explaining what's happening in relation to that imagery. So this is where the Sarmatians come in. Remember, until the Sarmatians arrived, there wasn't any actual dragon imagery in Britain, none that we know of. And so the Sarmatians were one of 2 cavalries in Britain. Now, up around Hadrian's Wall, there's a large area there which was eventually called or commanded by the Roman Dux Britanniarum, and his region was quite vast there. He commanded many forts, and these forts went from Hadrian's Wall all the way down to and beyond Ribchester, which is quite a large distance. Now, the significance of this region was that there were 2 cavalries. There were the Dacian cavalry and the Sarmatian cavalry, and both of them had dragons on their pennants. And of course, if you imagine these cavalries prancing around the countryside, the ancient Britons already knew about the imagery of the dragon. They already knew about the transition of Draco to Ursa Minor, and so they already knew that there was something in relation to their quest to simply not be conquered by Romans, but also in the sense of Draco having been given birth to the bear. And you can see by the time of Arthur that we have a father-son relationship expressed in Arthurian canon that goes and talks about Uther Pendragon being the father of the bear, that is the father of who we would call Arthur, who the Disney and in particular English version goes and calls him King Arthur. Of course, he was never a king. He was a dux. He was a warrior commanding the ancient Britain indigenous peoples against the incoming invaders. And by the time of the age of Arthur and the Anglo-Saxons invading, of course, the Britons had already established and taken from the Sarmatians, as I'm about to discuss with you, the dragon. They'd even painted it red. And from there, you can see how this imagery of Uther Pendragon being the father of Arthur managed to evolve. So let's go back to the Dacians and to the Sarmatians. Now, the significance is quite very interesting, but also very, very pointed. The Dacians came from Dacia, naturally, but the difference between the Dacians and the Sarmatians who came from Sarmatia is that Dacia was part of the Roman Empire and Sarmatia was not. So that meant when the Dacians had finished their 20 years service and therefore retired, upon retirement, upon being elevated to a Roman citizen, the Dacians could just simply go home to Dacia, where they would be respected as Roman citizens and they would enjoy the full benefits of being so. The thing is, though, the poor old Sarmatians, Sarmatia wasn't part of the Roman Empire, so therefore there was no point them going back home to Sarmatia and resettling there, because the matter that they were Roman citizens meant nothing. There were no benefits of being Roman citizens in Sarmatia. So the Sarmatians, very wisely and cleverly, they realised that if they're going to retire somewhere, they should retire somewhere within the Roman Empire, and why not just simply retire where they were, and that is somewhere in Britain. So they did that. They negotiated the rights to settle on retirement at Ribchester. Now here's the curious thing. The Sarmatians were the best horsemen of the age of the Dacians and the Sarmatians and the Roman occupation. And there were 5,500 Sarmatians who'd settled, so that's quite a large number. And with these people having the right to settle at Ribchester, it means that not only did they simply retire and settle there, and by 3 or 4 generations they'd started naturalising into the ancient Britons, they also did so with their livery. And so, of course, you can imagine the first generation becoming the second, and the second becoming the third. These best horsemen of the age of the Roman Empire, they were actually also introducing their skills to the ancient Britons. So by the time 8 to 10 generations had passed, what had actually happened was that the Sarmatians had introduced their best horsemen of the age skills so much that by the age of Arthur, the ancient Britons were now the best horsemen of the age of Arthur. And of course, they were still carrying around their livery, their dragon pennants on their lances. The big difference, of course, ancient Britons, the indigenous Britons, they used the colour red, and they painted the colour red because the colour red relates simply to the ancient nature of longevity and the whole concept of indigenous heritage being handed down. And we know that from 33,000 BC, the Red Lady of Paviland, who happens to be a male, so should really be called the Red Prince of Paviland. We know that the red funerary rites next appear in the Red Dragon during the age of Arthur on the pennants. And so this goes and shows how the Red Dragon was simply introduced by the Sarmatians to the ancient Britons. And of course, by the time of Arthur and the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons, Arthur simply commanding forces against the Anglo-Saxons, they were riding as the best horsemen of the age against the Anglo-Saxons with the pennants, the Red Dragon on white. And because of their understanding of the transition of Draco to Ursa Minor, those constellations, therefore Draco giving birth to the bear and Arthur having to be raised to the titular position of the bear, thus the Red Dragon on white became the indigenous flag of Britain and continues to be, using all of that collective conflation of ideas, to be the indigenous flag of Britain today. How fabulous is that?